For this first foray into writing a program for the Maqueen robot, we're going to create just a very simple project that will make the robot drive forward for 1 second at approximately half the speed possible, wait, and then go back to the same position and basically repeat this over and over again. So a very simple forward and backward movement. We'll do that by starting firstly a new project. And as this is a new project, we don't have the Maqueen blocks available, so we have to add that extension. You can watch previous video or instructions for how to do that. But basically go to extensions. We need to put the URL in. So it is the https github dfrobot pxt Maqueen. Search for that and then click on it to add it in so that we have the Maqueen. So remembering we need to do that every time we start a new project. So what we're going to do now is create something in this forever loop. The forever loop being a special one built into a microbit. As a microcontroller, it wants to repeatedly run one program, and that starts in this forever loop. So what we're going to do is start by having our motors. Now the motor block lets you choose which motor, which direction, and what speed to use. Because we want to drive forward, we want both motors to work. We'll go with clockwise being move forward. Obviously the choices are clockwise or counterclockwise. And the speed we can do goes all the way up to 255. Now, some of you might already realize 255 is not a randomly chosen number. 255 being, of course, the biggest number we can get from 1 byte of data, or 8 bits. So again, this is deliberately chosen as the range of values, 0 through to 255. We can use a slider, of course, or we can type it in. I'm going to go for around about 128, which is sort of roughly half of what we can do there. So what's going to happen here is if we were to run this on our robot, it will immediately turn on both motors in the clockwise direction, so forward direction, at roughly half the speed, and that's what will keep happening. This technically will loop around again and turn the motors back on again, and loop around and turn them back on again. So really we've got this loop that's not all that useful, but we would have a robot that essentially just keeps going forward. But what I want to do is to drive forward for 1 second. So the way to do that is to put a pause in. So a pause is not a special Maqueen block, it's just one of the built-in basic blocks available. So I'm going to put one of those in. And the time that we need is in milliseconds. So 1 real second in milliseconds is 1,000, not 100. We can choose it from a drop down to make our life easier. But of course, if we wanted something more specific, maybe 3 seconds, we don't have that in the drop list. So it's good to know that 1,000 is 1 real second. Now remember, maybe from other programming you've done, the pause does not stop the motors. What it does is pauses the continuation of the program. So at the moment, our motor would get turned on and would be running as set here, but our program would pause for another second before the loop would restart and the motors would get turned on. So at no time would the motors still stop. What I'm now going to do is actually stop the motors. One thing which is good to know is the Maqueen robot doesn't really like going from one direction movement, for example clockwise, straight into the reverse direction, especially at higher speeds. It can actually have problems doing that with the built-in gearboxes. So it's always a good idea to stop your robot before you change motor direction. So again, I'm going to choose a special Maqueen block, and I've got a motor stop block here. And again, because I've got both motors running at the moment, I want to stop both. So now our loop says start the motors, pause the program for a second, then stop the motors. But if we were to run this, you might realize there is actually a problem. And that is this loop. Because right now, as soon as we stop the motors, the loop starts again and the motors get turned back on. And this, of course, would happen so quickly that we wouldn't even perceive the motors stopping. So this is not really doing what we want yet. The way to fix that is maybe put a little bit more of a pause in there. Okay, so we might go in and add a pause. Maybe not a whole second, maybe just a tenth of a second, just to really make sure we've stopped. Now we're going to put it into reverse. So essentially we're going to replicate what we've done with the other direction. So I'm going to make my life a bit easy just by duplicating that block and putting it underneath. Instead of being in the clockwise direction, I'm going to now change it to counterclockwise, so the reverse direction. I'm going to run for the same amount of time, so another second, to make sure that I essentially go back to my starting point. I'm going to put another stop in to turn the motors off, and I'm going to put that little pause as well in there to make sure it really happens. So now what I have is a loop that first of all turns on the motors in the clockwise or forward direction, goes for 1 second because it pauses, then it stops the motors. Does a little pause just to really make sure they've stopped. Then it puts it into the reverse direction for another second of running, stops the motors again for a tiny little pause. Then the loop happens again and we go back to forward movement. So this loop will basically have our robot going forwards and backwards forever until we basically kill the power or turn it off. So we're basically ready to program this. The last thing we really should do, of course, is to name it. My suggestion when we name things is to use a common way of doing it. In my case, I like to suggest my students use their last name, then their first name, and then a name for the task that they're doing. So if I was doing this one, I would write Atomic Nathan, and then I would maybe put forwards, backwards. Okay, and when I then save or press download, I will get my hex file that I can then upload onto my microbit. That's something that you can be shown by your teacher or work out how to do, or maybe watch a different video. We won't do it in this one, but we will then have a program that our microbit can run to make our robot move backwards and forwards. So have a go at that. Things you can do to experiment and try something different is obviously change the speeds themselves and the pause times. See if you can get different distances. You might even like to do some experimentation to see how far you get with different speeds. It's always a good thing to know the distance your robot will travel at a certain speed. That would help you to work out how much time you might need to go, because there's no command here that says move for a certain amount of time or a certain distance. It's all based on speed and this pause. So you might want to work out, what values might get you a certain distance of movement. So have a play with this, test it out, play around with the values, see what you can work out. But that's our first foray into writing a program using the microbit make code and making it run on our Maqueen robot.